Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to make a plea concerning a rather unfortunate trend developing in performances of Beethoven's Ninth, the work about which it is impossible to even think unless one is suitably attired, the ultimate monument in Western orchestral music. I mean, come on. What is happening to our beloved Ninth? It is getting reduced, denatured, demonumentalized. And that's a terrible thing, an absolutely unconditionally terrible thing. Now, I understand there is a little history going on here, right? The history is that the theoretically monumental approach to the Ninth was the creation of the Romantic Age, of Wagner particularly. And it was taken up by most conductors, German conductors especially, who approached it with an almost mystical reverence, which isn't a bad thing. It's kind of a mystically reverent piece when you think about it. I mean, especially the Adagio and its message of universal brotherhood. I mean, you cannot say that it is not a gigantic work, both musically and conceptually. I mean, we have timings from like the original performances in London. It lasted more than an hour back then. So, the period instrument people with their metronome markings and all of that falderall really haven't taught us anything new about the size and scale of the piece. Just the opposite. They have descaled it. They're reducing it to a smidge. I mean, part of the problem, yes, is admittedly the period instrument movement, because most of those performances take place for purely financial reasons. It has nothing to do with original this or authentic that. They did none of that bullshit. It's because it's cheaper to do it with smaller forces. And so they do. Also, it's easier to have, we're having a cat fight over there. Also, it's easier to do it with single woodwinds. It's also a question of expense, of course, but if you use smaller strings, you could use double winds the way Beethoven wrote it instead of having to doubling instruments. But doubling instruments in Beethoven's day was no big deal. Whenever you had a big orchestra, you doubled the instruments, and you naturally wanted as big an orchestra as possible. And if any piece calls for as big an orchestra as possible, it is, of course, Beethoven's Ninth. The forces required for a symphonic work of the day are comparatively huge. I mean, the only thing that's a little bit bigger, by like an instrument or two or some other things, is Haydn's The Seasons. Those are like the two most gigantic concert works of the day, written in that Viennese style. So, yes, you can do it big, and there's nothing wrong with doing it big. But the bigness isn't just a question of, for example, tempo or size of the orchestra, or, volume of sound and nothing. It's a question of concept, of how you handle, the work in terms of your interpretive approach. Do you play that Adagio in 10 minutes, or do you play it in 18 minutes or something in between, like Klemperer does, 15 minutes? That's about ideal, I think. Do you take all the repeats in the scherzo? How do you adjust the instrumentation, which has all kinds of problems? Nobody should play the Ninth exactly the way Beethoven wrote it, because he was deaf, and it doesn't really work terribly well exactly the way he wrote it. You have to make adjustments, and whether you make those adjustments in terms of actual instrumentation or whether you do it in terms of dynamic inflection and accent, everybody's adjusting, even the period instrument folks. It's absolutely essential. But I'll give you a simple example of how one's view of the Ninth is a function of the interpretation. At the very end, there's that Freude, Schöne, Gott, der Funk, and the chorus at the end. If you follow Beethoven's metronome markings exactly, which are, by the way, impossible, you should never follow Beethoven's metronome markings, because he marks maestoso while he's speeding up, and it's like, yeah, da, 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 the violins come down, and it's da, 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 dum, ba, da, 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 and then it's marked prestissimo, Right? The engine goes as fast as possible. Like Furtwängler does it faster than as fast as possible, really up to a circusy, absurd degree. But it's the right concept. Carl Böhm gets it right in his first recording, really, really well. And other conductors do too. If you follow Beethoven's metronome markings, however, what you get is a chorus that goes da 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 bum da 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 dum da 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 dum, and the prestissimo is slower than the chorus that came before. It doesn't sound right. It makes no sense. I mean, do you follow the words? Do you follow the metronome markings? Do you look at the time signatures and try and figure out proportionate tempos? These are the kinds of tricky things that interpreters have to do. And there is no one answer. There is no single right answer. There is only the approach. And that approach can make the piece sound grander and more magnificent and cosmic, or it can sound very quotidien, very workaday, very, you minimize those aspects of it. And minimizing, it seems to be where we are these days. And I find that terribly, terribly frustrating. I really do. I mean, even conductors who are literalists like Toscanini or Leinsdorf was one too, who takes that final choral bit rather quickly. But the grandeur is there because the size is there, right? The amplitude is there. There are many ways to realize the work's bigness without having to be Wagnerian, and self-evidently grandiose, because the grandiosity is inherent in the work. I mean, that's what Beethoven intended. That's what the music expresses. Universality, bigness, all-encompassingosity, all of those things are in the Ninth. That's why we dress when we discuss the Ninth, because it's special. And a performance of the Ninth ought to be special. One of the other reasons, I think, aside from the period instrument authenticity nonsense that has diminished our perception of the Ninth, is the fact that it's no longer a special event. In fact, it barely matters at all. I thought of that recently. I was just reviewing this horror show, this complete Beethoven cycle, a Beethoven journey. A journey to what? To where? To a diner? To a McDonald's? That's what this is. A Beethoven journey with the Verbier Festival Chamber Orchestra under Gabor Takashnagi on Deutsche Grammophon. It's a vanity production that was recorded by the Verbier Festival. It's licensed from them. They paid for it. It has no particular value. But the point is this. These cycles that we make today, we don't see Beethoven symphony recordings individually. And that is a big deal when it comes to our recorded understanding of the Ninth. They all come in little boxes like this. Now, these performances were recorded over like a 10-year period or something, multiple times, but they weren't released separately. They waited, they threw them all in a box, poof, there they all are. Take them, there you go. Have some. Have a box of Beethoven. And somewhere in that box of Beethoven, you get the Ninth. Well, the Ninth is not special when it's just the last CD in the box, especially if the interpretations are, as I've described, interpretations that, that was a bleep thing, interpretations that minimize, the grandeur and size of the work and the scale of the work and the interpretive cosmic universality of the work. You get all the other symphonies, and then the Ninth is just the end. It's not a special anything. And this journey, which is supposed to culminate in the Ninth, culminates in nothing, because the Ninth is just as small scale and uninteresting and completely ordinary as everything else. Now, of course, none of the Beethoven symphonies are ordinary. They shouldn't sound ordinary. But when you pack them all together like that, and you have the same approach, and maybe an interpreter who doesn't distinguish between the works in a way that characterizes each one in a compelling way, then ordinariness reigns. And there's nothing more horrible than an ordinary Ninth. Nothing. I mean, nothing. It's a joke. It's a tragedy when it's as ordinary as they are in these cycles. It happens over and over again. Part of the problem also is the fact that these symphonies are now getting recorded not just with period instrument forces, which are small and sound small even when they're not small, but with chamber ensembles like this thing, the Verbier Chamber Orchestra, tiny, tiny groups. And the Ninth is not written for a tiny group. Clearly it's not. And they get played that way anyway. It's a disgrace. It's an offense against Beethoven's concept. The thing about Beethoven's Ninth that really has historically made it special, and you think about it for a minute, it's not just like what Wagner said. It's not the romantic thing. It's that the piece is incredibly forward-looking. It's late Beethoven. It's one of those 3 or 4 late works. You have the late piano sonatas, the late quartets, the Missa Solemnis, and the Ninth. That is late Beethoven. And late Beethoven was living in another world. He was not a typical classical composer anymore. He was looking to the future. His music was regarded as so futuristic that it was unintelligible to audiences of the day. And it was only much, much, much later that it began to catch on, that people began to realize and appreciate its forward-looking qualities. And those qualities are everywhere evident in the Ninth. So to try and reduce it to just another day at the symphony a la Beethoven in 1823 is a crime. It's just a crime. And so one of the things one of you asked me recently was, could you give us the best recent Beethoven cycles? I don't know exactly what recent means. And some of these smaller scale ones have been great. Like I mentioned, the Paavo Järvi Beethoven cycle is tremendous. If you want to have a great modern Beethoven cycle with smaller forces, the Ninth is not 100% successful in my view because of those smaller forces, but the interpretation is very good. He gets it. He gets the scope of it and transmits some of that in terms of his tempi and relationships and between sections and whatnot. So it works. And my point is that the work deserves better. It deserves the best of us. It deserves to retain that special quality. And when you're releasing Beethoven cycles in little boxes all at once, there's value in scarcity. You don't get the sense that the artists have given each work its individuality. They haven't savored the potential of each piece and then waited to release a mature interpretation. And that goes with all of the symphonies. All of them. I mean, God knows it's just as important in the Eroica as it is in the Ninth. But it's especially important when you get to the Ninth. It should come out last. It should be the culmination of the cycle. Or if it doesn't come out last, everything should somehow feel as though it's leading up to it. It needs to have that quality of an event. And just from a purely marketing point of view, a singleton release of one symphony on one disc is more an event than a box of 9. All in a tiny little box at cheapy price. You have to act and behave and play and perform and think as though this music matters hugely, matters to the point where it deserves special attention from the listeners, from the artists, from all of us, because the music rewards that. It asks for it, it begs for it, and it rewards you 1,000-fold over as a listener when it's given that kind of attention. And that is why, when we discuss the Ninth, we must be accoutred accordingly. You cannot talk about the Ninth, the monument of all of Western symphonicity, unless you are suitably dressed, in a suitable frame of mind, if the artists treat it with suitable respect, with reverence. You know me. I am totally opposed to the classical music bullshit, the snobbery. It's not about that. It's not about elitism. It's about the fact that some works are more special than other works, and that specialness is an inherent quality of the work itself, and a successful interpretation will realize that. I mean, you've got a choice. You can have this, or you can have this. Which would you prefer? That's the question. It seems to me the answer is pretty obvious. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.